Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a fascinating journey into the Renaissance.
That pivotal period, yeah.
All right.
Roughly 15th, 16th centuries.
Exactly, when Europe was sort of shifting, moving from the Middle Ages towards, well, modernity.
It's a term everyone knows, or thinks they know. Images of great art, maybe.
Right, and that sense of, cultural rebirth. So our mission in this deep dive is to really pull out the most important, the most intriguing bits of this whole transformative era for you.
What, using our sources, yeah. And it covers so much art, architecture, politics.
Literature, exploration, science. It's huge.
And that name itself, Renaissance. It literally means rebirth.
Ah, right. Where did that come from?
Well, the Italian Rinascita, Giorgio Vasari, used it first, around 1550, in his Lives of the Artists.
Okay, to describe what he was seeing in art.
Exactly. Then the French picked it up as Renaissance, and it came into English later, 19th century, to cover the whole period.
Okay, so this idea of rebirth, it suggests some kind of spark, right? What was the intellectual engine behind it all?
Fundamentally, it was humanism.
Humanism.
Yeah, but maybe not quite how we use the word today. It was really a movement inspired by the classical world, Greece, and Rome.
Oh, cool.
It grew out of the Roman idea of humanitas, cultivating human potential, virtue.
Right.
And rediscovering classical Greek philosophy, thinkers like Protagoras.
Man is the measure of all things.
That's the one. It really offered a new perspective on what humans could be, what they could achieve.
So kind of reconnecting with these ancient ways of thinking. When did this start? And where?
Well, it wasn't like a switch flicked on everywhere at once.
No, I imagine not.
The earliest, clearest signs really pop up in Italy. Late 13th century, actually.
That early?
Yeah, you can see hints of it in, say, Dante's writings or Giotto's paintings.
Interesting. So how did this new focus, how did it differ from the Middle Ages before it? Was it a total break?
That's a big debate among historians, actually.
Okay.
The, let's say, traditional view, maybe more 19th century, really stressed it as a distinct break, focused on the modern aspects.
Right. Leaving the Dark Ages behind.
Kind of. But many historians today emphasize the continuities. They see it more as developing out of the Middle Ages.
More of an evolution.
Exactly. Erwin Panofsky, the art historian, famously said they were connected by 1,000 ties. And you also hear the term long Renaissance sometimes, like 14th to 17th century, which kind of reflects that gradual change.
Okay, so Italy was the starting point. Which cities were key? How did it, evolve there?
Florence. Florence was definitely the first big center.
And Medicis and all that.
Yeah, its whole social structure, civic life. That was crucial. Its politics, the Medici patronage you mentioned, absolutely. And then, critically, the arrival of Greek scholars.
Constantinople fell, 1453.
Precisely. That brought a huge influx of scholars, and perhaps more importantly, their ancient texts, manuscripts largely lost to the West.
Wow, so that knowledge transfer was key.
Hugely important. And beyond Florence, while other Italian cities jumped in, Venice, Genoa, Milan, Rome,
especially with the Renaissance popes, right?
Oh, definitely. And Naples, too. They all became major centers.
And when do we usually say the Italian Renaissance kind of wound down?
Conventionally. The sack of Rome in 1527 is often seen as the symbolic endpoint.
But the influence didn't just vanish.
Not at all. It lived on. You see its impact in later Italian artists, big names like Tintoretto or Sofonisba Anguissola, Veronese, well into the later 16th century.
You mentioned the debate among historians about whether it was really an advance. What's that about?
Well, some scholars, maybe reacting against that 19th century tendency to idealize it, questioned if it was truly progress compared to the Middle Ages.
How so?
They might point to, say, a strain of pessimism or maybe an almost nostalgic longing for antiquity. And then you have social and economic historians
looking at different factors.
Right. They often focus more on the continuities, the long-term trends in society, the economy. That didn't just abruptly change.
Makes sense.
And it's worth remembering, too, there were earlier renaissances, smaller sparks of cultural revival within the Middle Ages itself.
Like the Carolingian one.
Exactly. Carolingian, Ottonian, the 12th century Renaissance. It shows that this kind of cultural rebirth wasn't totally unique to the 15th and 16th centuries.
Okay, so Italy's the start. What were the main characteristics of this whole movement? What really defined it?
Well, a core element was the humanist method, how they studied things.
Right. You mentioned humanism. How did they study?
It involved going directly to the ancient texts In the original languages, Latin first, then Greek became huge.
Bypassing medieval interpretations.
Largely, yes. And a strong emphasis on reason, on empirical evidence, observing the world.
That sounds different from the medieval approach.
It was quite different from scholasticism, yeah. Scholasticism often focused on resolving contradictions between established authorities within the existing books, so to speak.
Whereas humanism was more like...
More like going back to the original sources, reading them fresh, and even testing things out, experimenting.
So less about just accepting what was written, more about investigation.
Exactly. And this whole approach shaped education, the Studia Humanitatis. Basically, yes. A curriculum focused on things like poetry, grammar, history, moral philosophy, or rhetoric. The goal was to create well-rounded individuals.
Renaissance man.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The uomo universal, the universal man, someone excelling intellectually and physically, inspired by those Greco-Roman ideals. Leonardo da Vinci is the classic example, of course.
Absolutely. And libraries became important too, right?
Yeah.
Not just for storing books.
Very important. Public libraries started popping up, becoming real hubs for exchanging ideas, places where scholarship was valued.
And private collectors.
Oh, yes. Wealthy bibliophiles built amazing private collections. Sometimes they even opened them up to scholars. And they started developing cataloging systems. You needed them to manage all these books.
Okay, beyond the intellectual side, the Renaissance is obviously famous for art. What were the big changes there?
Huge changes. One of the absolute game changers was linear perspective.
Making paintings look 3D.
Essentially, yes. Creating a realistic illusion of depth on a flat surface. Giotto had hinted at it earlier.
Right.
But it was really formalized. It turned into a system by the architect Brunelleschi and the writer Alberti.
That must have completely changed how people saw paintings.
Fundamentally. And this drive for realism went further. Artists studied light, shadow, human anatomy in incredible detail.
Leonardo's drawings.
Exactly. His anatomical studies are astounding. The aim was understanding nature, understanding beauty, aesthetics. And you see this peak in masters like Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael.
Giants of art history.
Absolutely. But also Botticelli, Donatello, Titian, so many key figures.
And this wasn't just an Italian thing. You hear about the Northern Renaissance, too.
Definitely not just Italy.
Yeah.
You had a really vibrant artistic culture up in the Low Countries.
Flanders and places like that.
Exactly. Artists like Jan van Eyck, Hugo van der Goes, their skill with oil paint was incredible. Their naturalism, it massively influenced Italy.
Oil paint came from the north.
Perfected there, yeah. And later on, you get Peter Bruegel the Elder focusing on scenes of everyday peasant life. Really different.
And architecture, was that changing just as dramatically?
Oh, absolutely. Brunelleschi, again, he was crucial. He studied ancient Roman ruins, read the Roman architect Vitruvius.
Going back to the classics again.
Always. And this led to the Renaissance architectural style, using classical elements, columns, pilasters, arches, domes, in a new, harmonious, very measured way.
Like his dome in Florence.
The Florence Cathedral Dome, a revolutionary piece of engineering, and Alberti's church in Mantua, Sant'Andrea. Or think about the massive project of rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So many Renaissance architects worked on that.
It's important to remember, though, these artists, looking back at classical times, they weren't pagans, were they?
That's a really key point. No, they admired antiquity, its forms, its ideals, but they were overwhelmingly Christian. The church was a massive patron, after all.
Right.
Even before the main Renaissance period, you see artists like Nicola Pisano using classical forms in biblical sculptures. So the influence was there early on.
Okay, so art and architecture were transformed. What about science and technology? Was there innovation there too?
Yes, though maybe in different ways initially. In commerce, for instance, Luca Pacioli published the first big work on double-entry bookkeeping right at the end of the 15th century.
The foundation of modern accounting.
Pretty much. And then, of course, the printing press, around 1440.
Gutenberg. That changed everything.
Unbelievably so. It democratized learning, spread ideas like wildfire. Think about the challenge that posed to established authorities, both church and academic. A real revolution in information.
Hard to overestimate its impact.
Totally. Now, initially, the early Italian humanists, they were more focused on the humanities than, say, natural philosophy or science.
So they weren't immediately overturning scientific ideas.
Not right away. Their respect for classical authors initially kind of reinforced the old Greek views of the universe, Aristotle, Ptolemy, though you did have thinkers like Nicholas of Cusa who started to anticipate a sun-centered view.
So a gradual shift in science.
Exactly. And science and art were very closely linked at first. Think of Leonardo da Vinci again.
The ultimate polymath.
Right. His observational drawings, anatomy, plants, water, machines, they're incredible. He conducted experiments, developed ideas about research methods. Some call him a father of modern science.
His notebooks are legendary.
They really are. He worked on everything: engineering, acoustics, botany, geology, anatomy, mechanics. Amazing range.
So when did people start really questioning those ancient scientific authorities like Ptolemy or Galen in medicine?
Well, the voyages of discovery were a big catalyst. Columbus reaching the Americas in 1492.
Showed the old maps were wrong.
Exactly. It proved the classical understanding of the world was incomplete. And in medicine, too, anatomical observations started showing discrepancies with what Galen had written.
And this led towards the scientific revolution.
It definitely paved the way, especially in the Northern Renaissance, maybe partly influenced by the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. You see a shift, more focus on chemistry, biology.
A willingness to challenge the old ways.
Yes. Seeking answers through empirical evidence. Looking and testing, not just reading. And the growing importance of mathematics. Figures like Copernicus, Galileo, Francis Bacon, they champion this new scientific method.
So major breakthroughs followed.
Absolutely. Astronomy, physics, biology, anatomy. Copernicus proposing the heliocentric model, Vesalius revolutionizing anatomy with his dissections, and exploration. European explorers visited and mapped huge parts of the globe during this time.
Charting the unknown.
Pretty much everywhere except Antarctica. Columbus, then later the Dutch mapping Australia, calling it New Holland Tasman's voyages. Our whole picture of the planet changed. Antarctica came much later, of course.
Incredible expansion of knowledge.
Yeah.
What about shifts in, say, society, religion, music?
Big changes there, too. In music, you get the emergence of a common European musical language, particularly polyphony.
Complex interwoven melodies.
Exactly. The Franco-Flemish school developed this incredibly intricate style. It was spread by the printing press, too, and demanded by a growing, wealthy middle class. Composers like Palestrina, Lassus, Victoria, Bird in England, major figures.
When religion, humanism must have had an impact there.
Profoundly. Even though it was still a very Christian world and the church was a huge patron, humanism changed how people thought about the relationship between, well, man and God.
How so?
Humanist scholars, Erasmus, Zwingli, Thomas More, Luther, Calvin, they applied those humanist methods, like textual criticism, to religious texts, the Bible itself.
Looking at the original sources again.
Right. And this came after a period of turmoil in the late Middle Ages, the Western Schism, criticisms of papal corruption.
So the stage was set for change.
It really was. Erasmus and Luther especially used humanist scholarship to critique practices and doctrines, calling for reform based on a closer reading of the New Testament.
And Luther's 95 Theses.
That was the spark, 1517. Directly challenging papal authority, leading straight into the Protestant Reformation. So yes, humanism and the Renaissance played a direct, crucial role in kicking that off.
Though it wasn't always antagonistic, you mentioned Pope Paul III.
Right, it's complex. Paul III came later, after the sack of Rome, but he still engaged with the Renaissance culture. Copernicus dedicated his revolutionary book to him, and he commissioned major artworks.
It sounds like people living in the Renaissance started to feel they were in a new era. Did they have that sense of self-awareness?
They absolutely did. By the 15th century, you see Italian writers and artists talking about working in the modi antichi, the ancient style.
Defining themselves against the recent past.
Exactly. Petrarch, way back in the 1330s, had made a distinction between ancient times, Antiqua, and the Christian period, Nova, seeing his own time as a bit of an eclipse. Then Leonardo Bruni, writing a history of Florence, was the first to really use a three-part structure: antiquity, Middle Ages, and his own time, which he saw as a recovery. Flavio Biondo did something similar.
So they actually named the Middle Ages.
Yes. Humanist historians coined the term media tempestas Middle Ages for the period they felt they were leapfrogging over to reconnect directly with classical antiquity.
And Vasari used Rinascita.
Right, in his Lives of the Artists, solidifying that idea of a rebirth of art after what he saw as the decline of the Gothic style. He even divided it into phases based on artistic progress.
So these ideas start in Italy. How did they spread?
Pretty rapidly, actually. From Florence, across Italy, then out into the rest of Europe. The printing press was, again, absolutely key.
Speeding everything up.
Massively. And as the ideas spread, they changed. They adapted to local cultures, creating distinct regional and national movements, something 20th century scholars really focused on.
Okay, let's look at some of those regions. What did the Renaissance look like in England?
The English Renaissance really hit its stride in the Elizabethan era, late 16th century, though it started earlier under Henry VIII.
Shakespeare's time.
Exactly. Literature and music were the dominant forms. An incredible flowering Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spenser, Thomas More, Philip Sidney, and in music, Tallis, Taverner, Bird.
Less focus on visual arts than Italy.
Generally, yes. Architecture saw those grand prodigy houses, and later Inigo Jones brought in the Palladian style, inspired by the Italian architect Palladio. And crucially, you have Francis Bacon.
Pioneer of the scientific method.
A key figure in that transition, absolutely.
What about France? How did it arrive there?
It really came with the French invasion of Italy around 1495. King Charles VIII brought it back, in a way.
And King Francis himself was a big patron.
Huge. He actively imported Italian artists. Leonardo da Vinci spent his last years there. He built amazing palaces like Fontainebleau, Chambord.
So a very royal-led Renaissance.
To a large extent, yes. And you had major French writers like Rabelais and Montaigne, painters like Clouet, musicians. And Catherine de' Medici, when she married Henry II, brought a lot of Italian influence to the court, too. Arts, science, music.
And Germany and the Low Countries. How did it play out there?
It spread there in the later 15th century. Interestingly, the printing press had an early impact, and artists like Albrecht Dürer were doing amazing things even before direct Italian influence was massive.
Yeah.
In areas that became Protestant, humanism got tightly linked with the Reformation. You see that in the art and writing. But Gothic styles and older scholastic philosophy hung on longer there, well into the 16th century.
Any key rulers?
Emperor Maximilian I is often seen as the first real Renaissance monarch in the Holy Roman Empire.
Hungary was mentioned as being very early after Italy. Why was that?
Yeah, Hungary was surprisingly early in Central Europe. It had really strong ties with Italy, dynastic marriages, trade, culture.
There's a lot of exchange.
Definitely. Early patrons like Pippo Spano invited Italian artists, but it truly blossomed under King Matthias Corvinus.
Right, his library was famous.
The Bibliotheca Corviniana, yeah. Second biggest secular collection in Europe at the time. His wife, Beatrice of Naples, helped make the capital, Buda, a major artistic hub north of the Alps. He supported humanists, set up a printing press, built grand palaces with Italian artists.
Quite the Renaissance king.
He really was. Even had an observatory built, brought in top astronomers.
And back to the Low Countries, we mentioned their art, but anything else?
Well, trade through cities like Bruges was key. Wealthy merchants and nobles were patrons. And beyond art, think of Vesalius, the great anatomist, or Mercator, the mapmaker.
Crucial figures.
And Erasmus, the hugely influential humanist scholar. He was from Rotterdam.
So Northern Europe generally.
Yeah.
It wasn't just ideas flowing north from Italy.
No, it was complex. Music, for example, saw major innovation in the north. The Burgundian school, the polyphony of the Netherlanders that spread south and became the dominant international style for a while, influencing even Palestrina and Rome. Later, Italian musical innovations, like the Venetian school, spread north again.
A two-way street.
Definitely. Denmark had its own Renaissance moments, translating histories, building castles like Kronborg and Tycho Brahe, the astronomer.
A key figure in the scientific revolution.
Exactly. And one key difference often noted, Northern art often focused more on intense religious feeling or later detailed scenes of everyday life compared to the Italian focus on classical harmony and mythology. Plus, the North perfected oil painting, and writers started using vernacular languages much more widely, following Dante's lead.
Poland, too, you mentioned the Golden Age.
Yes, the Polish Renaissance, late 15th to late 16th century, under the Jagiellonian dynasty, it's seen as a cultural high point.
Italian influence there, too.
Significant early Italian humanist contact, yes. And Bona Sforza, an Italian princess who married the Polish king, brought a lot of Renaissance art and culture. Poland saw refined architecture, major literature in Polish, the language becoming important regionally, and its university in Krakow was a major center. Copernicus studied there.
And the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain.
Portugal's Renaissance was maybe less about art, more about exploration's impact.
Right, the age of discovery.
Exactly. Lisbon was a hub for navigation, math, astronomy, cartography, attracting experts, leading to huge mapping advances. They also did important work in botany and medicine based on discoveries overseas. And literature flourished. Camus' epic Os Lusíadas is the classic.
And Spain?
It came in via its Italian connections, especially through Aragon. Early writers emerged there. Then Castile saw strong Italian humanist influence. You get major writers, culminating in Cervantes' Don Quixote, often called the first modern novel.
Wow.
Humanism thrived with figures like Vives and Nebrija. Interestingly, Spain also had perhaps the first female university professor in Europe, Luisa de Medrano, at Salamanca.
Really?
Yeah, later Spanish Renaissance often had a strong religious, mystical focus. St. John the Cross, Teresa of Avila, alongside accounts of the New World. And great artists like El Greco and composers like Victoria.
It's amazing how that initial Italian spark lit so many different fires across Europe. Let's loop back to how historians have actually viewed the Renaissance over time. You mentioned Vasari coining Rinascita. How did the understanding develop?
Well, Vasari really framed it as a break from Gothic barbarity and a revival of classical art. But the term Renaissance for the whole period didn't really catch on widely until the 19th century.
Who popularized it?
The French historian Jules Michelet was key. He defined it as a whole historical era, but he emphasized science over art and maybe slightly nationalistically tried to claim it as more of a French thing.
Interesting. And then came Burckhardt. He's still huge, right?
Jacob Burckhardt, yes. His book, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy from 1860, was incredibly influential. He defined the Renaissance basically as Italy from Giotto to Michelangelo.
And what was his main idea?
He saw it as the birth of the modern individual, that the Middle Ages had suppressed individuality and the Renaissance unleashed it. That interpretation shaped thinking for generations.
But newer historians have pushed back or offered different takes.
Oh, yes. Many today are less keen on seeing it as one single unified thing. Randolph Starn suggested thinking of it more like a network of diverse, sometimes conflicting cultures, not a neat, time-bound block.
Makes it sound more complex.
It was, and there's still that debate about progress. Burckhardt saw clear advancement, but others point to negative social trends during the period. Though it's clear people at the time felt they were living in a new age.
And other interpretations. Marxist views.
Marxist historians focused on the economic shifts, the move towards capitalism as the underlying driver. And you had figures like Johann Huizinga who actually questioned if it was all positive change, seeing it in some ways as a decline from the High Middle Ages.
So no single easy answer.
Definitely not. Some historians now prefer the broader term early modern period, and some scholars, especially outside art history, even question how useful the whole concept of a distinct Renaissance really is.
And the word Renaissance gets used for other periods too.
All the time, those earlier medieval ones you mentioned, Carolingian, 12th century, but also revivals in other cultures like the Islamic Golden Age, or even modern ones like the Harlem Renaissance, the Disney Renaissance. It speaks to that powerful idea of cultural rebirth.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. After this deep dive, what's the main takeaway about the Renaissance?
I think the key is its complexity and its breadth. It was this incredibly dynamic period of change, innovation, touching almost everything. Yes, it looked back to classical antiquity, but it also created entirely new ways of thinking, making art, doing science, understanding religion.
So not just a simple rebirth of old stuff.
Not at all. It was a complicated mix of looking back and leaping forward, and it wasn't the same everywhere and maybe not better in every way, but it undeniably laid so much groundwork for the world we live in now.
Right. And with that, here's a final thought for you, our listener. How do the echoes of this huge transformation, this rebirth, still resonate today? Think about our art, our science, how we view human potential. The Renaissance legacy is all around us. What parts of it seem most relevant, maybe even inspiring for our own times? Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.